Welcome to Kairos Conversations. Why does Naaman take dirt from Israel back to Syria? Why does the sun stand still with Joshua? Why are we turning the Nile into blood in the Exodus account? These are all things that sound really weird to our modern ears, but made a whole lot of sense within an ancient Near Eastern worldview. Stick with us as we explain why. Hey, welcome to Kairos Conversations. I am Ryan, Kairos Classroom's Greek guy, and I'm here with Courtney, our resident Hebrew enthusiast. How are you doing today, Courtney?
I'm doing really great.
Good. No matter your background, if you're someone who wants to dig deeper into the Bible, has questions about Greek or Hebrew grammar, ancient Near Eastern culture, study tools, and resources, feel free to join us as we discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. Today, we're going to be talking about the ancient Near Eastern worldview. Our Bible wasn't written yesterday. Of course, it's God's word to us now. We believe that. But the documents that make up our Old Testament were written a really long time ago to cultures that are very different from our own. And today, we are going to be looking at kind of what general principles guided the worldviews of those cultures. What things that are very different from the way that we think about God, ourselves, the world, are at work in the worldviews of the ancient Near East. And we're going to be walking through these one by one. I've got five. We've got five that we're going to look at today. And we're going to break them down one by one. And with each one, maybe point out some places within the Old Testament story where we see these things at work, where these things really bear on our interpretations. Does this sound good, Courtney? Is this what you're hoping to do?
Yeah, no, this sounds like a lot of fun. This, for me, was one of those things that really changed the way I read the Bible. So I think it's really exciting to think about it in this way.
Awesome. Well, like I said, we got five. And we're going to start off here with our first one. There are many gods in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and they are real. What do we mean when we say this, Courtney, and why does this matter?
Yes, there are many gods, and they are real. So we're kind of already accustomed to thinking about the fact that the ancient Near Eastern culture was largely pagan, and they had many gods, were representative in every different culture. So we understand they had a polytheistic worldview. But really kind of within that polytheism, there's almost like a hierarchy, right? So there's like a high god and then lesser gods below them. But every single culture around Israel at that point in time would have had many gods, and these gods would actually be real. Like, I think a lot of times when we think of false gods, we just think they're completely fake and have no reality to them, no substance.
Yeah, I mean, I think of these texts in the prophets that kind of make fun of how, this is a God made of wood, and you're praying to it and expecting deliverance from it. And that all seems very silly to us, but it wasn't. It wasn't silly in an ancient Near Eastern worldview. This was religion. This was how people operated and conceived of the world.
Right, yeah. They didn't have this supernatural, natural divide in their head, or the sacred and secular divide. A lot of times in our world today, we think we live in just kind of the natural world throughout the week, and maybe we go to church on Sundays, but all of that was connected and imbued with divine activity. So these gods, these spirits were active all the time, and you really were trying your hardest to kind of get out from underneath the thumb of these powers. Yeah,
and this is where the question of worship, of monolatry, as scholars, anthropologists will say, the question to Israel of like, who are you going to worship? Like, which God is your God? Which God are you going to worship and submit to?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So is he a high God over many gods? Or is he the one true God? That's really the question that the Bible is trying to answer, and kind of the polemic or argumentation against this ancient Near Eastern religion that it's offering.
Great. That's really helpful. I can see how that comes into play in so many places, and is so fundamental to really just the way that we read the Bible as a whole. All right. Well, let's take a look at number 2 here. We have those gods, those many real gods. They perform specific functions. They do specific things. The moon god, the sun god, the sea god, the land god, the god of fertility. Tell us more about this and how this bears on our interpretation.
Yeah, so each of these gods were limited. All of these lesser gods were limited and performed specific functions. And so a lot of times in that ancient Near Eastern worldview, that concept of the high god, he was so far off that he didn't really deal in daily activities. So he allowed these lesser gods to control these specific functions, whether it's the sun or the moon. And these gods kind of have varying power, right? The sun only has power over the day. The moon only has power over the night. So they perform these functions.
Yeah, and of course these documents, from this time are going to assume that the reader knows these things, because this is just current, what people think and what people assume, and those things might be lost on us today. I mean, can you talk to us about the plagues in the Exodus account?
Yeah, so all of these plagues in the Exodus account are kind of throwing rocks at these polytheistic gods, right? So every single one of them, like the Nile, would have been a god. Like the Nile River, it's a powerful river, so it is a god in and of itself. And so the Nile turns to blood, and you can no longer have water, right? Well, that's because we have one God, Yahweh, who is in control of that. It is not its own God in and of itself. Or darkness, right? The sun is not its own God. God is controlling the sun. So all of these plagues represent a god, and that last final plague is attacking the god of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh himself, the king, would have been this God in human form, and he's saying, no, I can even touch you, right? I am in control and have created all things. So in a lot of ways, that Exodus account is a polemic against all of these polytheistic gods. It's de-deification, as some commentators like to put it. We're de-deifying.
De-deification.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Yahweh is asserting his lordship and his command over the domains of all of these gods. Great. All right. Onward. Number 3 here. The gods are limited geographically. I talked about Naaman bringing dirt from Israel. We'll get to that in a minute. But talk to us, Courtney, about kind of the geographical limitations of the gods in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, so each one of these clans or tribes or people groups would have had a particular god, even if that god performed a specific function that they especially attached to, that he was their tribal god, right? And so he would have been limited by their land, and he was only the god of their land. And so as you exit that god's land, you may not have the protection that you're normally used to, right? Or you hope that he's still protecting your land when it's going to be invaded by other empires or other people groups as well.
Think of the people of Israel, leaving Egypt, headed towards the promised land, and how, at least me reading this story growing up, I would just be like, you morons, Yahweh just delivered you from Egypt, just opened up a sea for you, and now you're worried that he's not going to feed you, or that you're going to fall in battle going into the places that he's promised to you. But this was a real thing for an ancient Near Eastern person. Like, okay, sure, Yahweh delivered me in Egypt, but does his authority extend to this place where there are these other gods?
Right.
That was the point that was hard to believe.
Yeah, you had no faith that your God could work outside of that land where you had first experienced him, right? So, but what God is teaching his people is that I am not like the gods in Egypt, and he's very patient with them, even through the desert. Yeah. And part of that is like why they didn't go straight to Canaan, right? They needed to stop and figure out what kind of God this really was. And so let's stop at Sinai and let's have a chit chat, right? That's a good way to put it.
Lots of lessons to learn along the way. Yeah. Why does Naaman bring dirt from Israel back to Syria? Yeah,
so he experienced the power of God in Israel, right? He experienced the power of God there. He even says, like, do we not have better rivers over there? Why do I need to go to the Jordan, right? And then, he goes and he dips and he's cured of his leprosy. And he's like, wait, I'm going to take some dirt back, right? Because he's going to make an altar to Yahweh there. And he wants to worship God in the place where he experienced God, because that's where his people are, that's where his covenant is, and that's where you can come into fellowship with him. So it totally makes sense if you have this idea that in some ways the gods are especially geographically attached to a particular place.
Yeah, that does make sense. Seems random if you don't know that, but with that idea, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Makes a whole lot of sense.
Let's look at number 4 here. The power of the gods is judged by the power of the people who worship them. So like in this paradigm, Yahweh would be judged by the strength and power of the Israelites. What does this mean? How does this change the way we read?
Yeah, this is why the Old Testament is completely overturning all of the paradigms of the people groups around them, because God chooses a people that doesn't have a land, chooses a people that isn't even a people yet. It's just one man initially with Abraham, right? And he's going to make them a people. So he isn't a God who appropriates a people or appropriates a land. He makes them a people and he gives them a land because he's in control of everything, right? And he's the creator God, so he can create his people. And so you see this line kind of repeated all throughout the Old Testament, that you are the smallest of all the people groups, right? You are the most insignificant. And so his power is not reflected by his people at all. His power is unique to himself, and he is God within himself, and he doesn't need any external categories to be great, right?
Yeah, in our individualistic modern mindset, this almost seems obvious. Like, why would God be tied to, his people? He's God; they're the people. But that's not how people thought 3,000 years ago. This is not what people assume. People would judge the strength of a God by the success or victory or kind of flourishing the people that lived in that God's domain of the people subjects who worshipped that God. And Yahweh's dominance, Yahweh's greatness, kind of being independent of that, and is very counterintuitive in the ancient worldview.
Yeah, and again, going back to that Exodus story, he takes his people out of one of the greatest empires of that time, right? Their gods would have been seen as superior because they were such a powerful and strong people, and yet he is able to subdue them and rescue his people out of Egypt. And also, one other thing to think about is that all of these gods, we tend to think of like the Israelite religion, we think of Levitical priests, we think of prophets in Israel, we think of all of these miracles that God can perform, but all of these other religions would have had their own priests, their own diviners, their own prophets. Those gods would have always had a mouthpiece to the people. But you see kind of something different throughout the Israelite religion, is that he raises up prophets, but he reveals himself. He doesn't need people to reveal him. He's able to reveal his own power. And that's also weird when we think about magic and kind of what that looks like. But those diviners in Egypt could replicate the first two plagues. They figured out how to engage with these spiritual forces that are real, these many gods that are real, to actually replicate those first two plagues.
But not after that. There's a limit.
There's a limit, and the people of Israel are not supposed to engage in that kind of magic. You're not supposed to manipulate the material world to gain spiritual favor. So, and
they get in trouble as they try to do that. When Yahweh is treated as the other gods. Yeah, that's a good word that makes a lot of sense. All right, finally here, number 5. These gods, these many real gods, they are unstable and volatile, capricious, could I say?
Yes, you could. They are unstable and they are volatile. So whatever power they may have in a single moment does not mean that they will maintain that power forever. There's a spiritual battle going on, and they could lose that power. One of the most indicative examples within the Bible is Baal, right? He is a fertility god, but we know every single year he dies, right? Or every single year he's dethroned from his power. And how do we know that? Because spring happens after winter. So Baal dies in the winter, right? And so you kind of never had this sense and this feeling that God was always the same in character. He could fluctuate. He could be angry with you. You never knew what he expected of you. But realistically, you never knew if he was actually on the throne or not. Was he actually in the temple when you went to worship him?
Or when you're trying to get fire to come down, and you're on the mountain with Elijah, and they're trying to get Baal's attention. You don't know where he is. You don't know if he's on the throne, in the bathroom. What's he doing? This is, Elijah poking fun at the prophets of Baal. But it's based on this idea. And he knows that his God, that Yahweh, the creator God of all, is not like that.
Yeah, he's not like that. And that's why Exodus 34, 6 and 7, where he gives his character, is one of the most important texts in the entire Old Testament, because he is always going to be this way, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Like, he is always going to be that way. And he has given them a specific prescription as to how to come into communion with him. He's always on the throne. His ark represents his throne. He's always there. And he's told them how they can fellowship with him, which is all of that Levitical priestly system. So he's very different than the other gods.
Very different. And again, like our worldview today is so formed by these things that it's hard for us to see the foil. It's hard for us to see the difference between the way Yahweh is presented in the Old Testament and what would have been assumed of a God in that ancient context. Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for walking us through these things. And I hope that these categories will help you. I was talking with Courtney before we recorded this. Is once you have these categories, you see these things everywhere. Like you'll be reading a text and it's just like, well, I see that. I see how that's the tacit assumption here. And if we don't know these things, it's easy for us to miss it. Is there anything you want to leave us with just on the Ancient Near Eastern Worldview as a whole and how it matters for us as readers of the Old Testament today?
Yeah, I think just a couple of things. We mentioned the Joshua text in the beginning. We didn't talk about it, but I just wanted to say, like, that's, again, goes back to these diviners who were looking to manipulate or interpret the material world because they didn't have revelation from God. And so, there are days in our monthly calendars where both the sun and the moon will be there. In the sky at the same time, like, you wake up and the moon is still there, even though the sun has risen. And so that's what's related to in Joshua. And those days were considered bad omens. Like, you shouldn't go to war on those days. Even on that day that was a bad omen, somehow these people came out to fight and it ensured the Israelite victory. So it just is, again, poking fun at the way that they thought they could manipulate the gods. They thought they could manipulate them, but even then they couldn't ensure a victory. And if you want to learn more about this is like a slightly thicker book, but it is accessible. That talks about ancient Near Eastern thought by John Walton. And he gets into a lot of this and goes into kind of temples and all kinds of things as to how they would have thought about gods and thought about their religious world. And so that's an exciting book to read if you wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper. Awesome. Tell us the name of that book one more time. We'll put the link. Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament by John Walton. Yeah. John Walton. Awesome. This is so helpful. I mean, even for me to think back through these categories, and thank you for presenting them to us, Courtney. This is really helpful. All right. Well, that's it for this conversation. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more on Old Testament, New Testament, biblical studies, the way that viewing the Bible through the original languages can help us to better understand and interpret it. We will see you next time on Kairos Conversations.